I've always thought it was remarkable that Tolkien basically spent his entire life creating what he called the secondary world. He created the languages, he created the thousands of years of history. It's so rich and so detailed that nobody today that writes a piece of fiction is ever going to come close to the sheer wealth of information and detail. Of course, all of that makes it fiendishly difficult to adapt into any sort of movie.
Behind one of the most ambitious film projects in history is the extremely popular book, the result of the life's work of one man. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born on the 3rd of January 1892 in Bloemfontein, South Africa, to English parents who had emigrated there. Just a month after his 4th birthday, when John Ronald was in Birmingham visiting his grandparents, his father, Arthur, died suddenly. Tolkien became half-orphaned in a country he didn't know.
The absence of a father would have affected him. In a way, he became the father to his younger brother. He was raised by his mother, who he was very close to.
In 1904, Mabel died from complications arising from diabetes. Tolkien was only 12.
After that, he was shuffling from one place to another with only a guardian to look after him.
There were something like 10 different houses he lived in the city. That life is quite a complicated one, quite an eventful one for a child.
His mother had been his first teacher, encouraging him to take an interest in words. Her death cemented his study of languages.
And I think in those circumstances, the school really was the refuge. It was the stable element in his life. And I also think it was a particularly good school for the likes of Tolkien. The school, I would say, was not remarkable for literary development, but it was very remarkable for producing linguists.
He formed a close bond with 3 school friends, and together they created the Tea Club of the Barovian Society, known as the TCBS, a small club based on the mutual love of heroic legends and sagas. This close friendship and shared interest in ancient languages continued throughout Tolkien's time in Oxford, where he went in 1911 to study English language and literature. But this idyllic period came to an end with the outbreak of war. Tolkien departed for France, serving as a lieutenant in the Battle of the Somme. Likewise, all of his close friends were drawn into the combat.
He had a small group of close friends, and a few years later, nearly all of them were dead, all killed in the First World War. Once again, he found himself on his own. How could it not have had a marked effect on the way he wrote and the way he thought? And people do say that the major theme of his writing is death.
During rare moments of quiet, he jotted down stories in a notebook, which he called the Book of Lost Tales.
That's where Middle-earth was born. Some of the very earliest writings of Middle-earth that Tolkien created were done in pencil on a notebook while he was in the trenches.
Tolkien's love of languages would eventually lead to him creating his own, and his lifelong pursuit of creating such language engendered the desire to create his own mythology.
He felt deeply that England lacked a mythology.
Well, England has no overriding mythology. We have a lot of folk tales, and we have borrowed a lot of other people's mythologies. The one that everybody regards as English is the story of King Arthur. But actually that's a complete mishmash from different sources, many of them French, our old enemy. So for Tolkien, the Romance mythologies were a very difficult thing. He didn't feel that they should be part of English folklore or mythology at all.
He really mourned the fact that any mythology that England may have had been basically eradicated by the Norman invasion in 1066. There was this vacuum that Tolkien wanted to fill by inventing his own English mythology. Right at the end of his life, he was still working on the mythology of Middle-earth, and he died with his great sort of life work only partially complete. The Silmarillion, which was the story that he was writing in the trenches in 1917, wasn't published until after his death, and his son Christopher had to step in and do the finishing touches.
Yet during his lifetime, elements of this mythology would reach the world through his novels. Tolkien returned to Oxford in 1925 as Professor of Anglo-Saxon, but 9 years later, an unexpected and seemingly innocuous event would change the life of this Oxford don forever.
We have a story about Tolkien inventing hobbits. There he is, you know, marking his examination papers, which is extremely boring, and he turns over and he finds a blank sheet and he writes on it, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." And that's the start of the whole thing.
And so, the story of this small, nature-loving creature found its way into print.
Well, my father was the publisher, and he believed that children were the best judges of children's books. He used to pay me, as a supplement to my pocket money, a shilling. So The Hobbit came along, and I wrote my report. It wasn't a great piece of literary criticism, but it was good enough. My report on The Hobbit was dated the 30th of October 1936. Bilbo Baggins was a hobbit who lived in his hobbit hole and never went for adventures. At last Gandalf the wizard and his dwarves persuaded him to go. He had a very exciting time fighting goblins and wargs, and after a terrific battle with the goblins, he returned home rich. This book, with the help of maps, does not need any illustrations. It is good and should appeal to all children between the ages of 5 and 9. In those happy days, no second opinion was needed. If I said it was good enough to publish, it was published.
With the success of The Hobbit, Tolkien was encouraged by Stanley Unwin to write a sequel. He thus began to delve back into the mythology he'd been working on his whole life, and it became The Lord of the Rings.
He sat down and began to write the first page of The Lord of the Rings without any planning at all. There was no scheme, no synopsis. I mean, I've been through all those first drafts, those papers which all still survive. And it's perfectly clear that he was flying blind. He never intended it to be what it was, and it gradually shaped itself as he wrote it.
To be a convincing story, you've got to know what you're talking about in every detail. You've got to know what the geology, the geography, the history, which Tolkien had already mapped out years and years before. It was as real to Tolkien as history.
Even though The Lord of the Rings is regarded sort of as, you know, the Tolkien masterpiece, he only regarded it as being a very small piece of the mythology.
It was only just the tip of an iceberg. He knew, and he'd written and put in the box files, an awful lot that never was in his lifetime known to anybody.
It also gives Lord of the Rings its enormous depth, and that is what somehow makes it transcend a piece of fiction, and it does feel much more authentic. That no author who writes a piece of fiction would spend this amount of time, basically a lifetime, on creating the world behind the fiction.
I desired to do this for my own satisfaction, and I had little hope that other people would be interested in this work, especially since it was primarily linguistic in inspiration and was begun in order to provide the necessary background of history for Elvish tongues.
This was simply an outlet for his huge imagination, which had been stimulated by philology, by studying Germanic languages, by studying Norse sagas, by studying Anglo-Saxon poetry. And that drove him not just to be a scholarly investigator of it, but to be a creator in the same genre.
The first volume of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Fellowship of the Ring, was published by Allen and Unwin in 1954. It had taken Tolkien 12 years to complete his epic work. By now, he was nearly 60.
He was exacting to a degree on how the book was produced.
He was extremely stubborn and obstinate, and he wrote it the way he wanted to.
You did not go around editing Tolkien. That would have been the absolute final sin. After all, he was a professor of English language and literature and knew what he was writing. I had very carefully made my estimate of losing £1,000 on the basis that there would be a fall-off. There wasn't. In fact, by the time we got to publishing Book 3, we had increased our print number and on the way to reprinting 1 and 2.
Over time, the book increased in popularity, eventually becoming the 20th century's second most read book after the Bible.
He was both pleased and gratified by the success, but it wasn't because of the money. He was gratified because it proved his point. And there was an element in it, I would have said, of schadenfreude. You know, they told him all his life that he was a kind of, flogging a dead horse. And it wasn't a dead horse, it was a Derby winner.
Tolkien fan clubs began to spring up almost as soon as the book became well known. Not quite as when it was published in the 50s, but by the 60s they were starting to appear.
You began to go to the New York subway and see sort of inscriptions on the walls saying Frodo lives. And you began to realize that something was happening.
And people were writing him letters telling him that they had adopted the names of his characters and they were getting married in ceremonies based on his books. And he was actually very upset by this because he was actually able to detach himself from his own invention.
The phenomenon of the Lord of the Rings continues today, and its popularity can be attributed to fundamental themes of human existence.
The themes of Tolkien are another way of honouring the book because, you know, as we were saying, there's so much detail that you ultimately can't recreate the world of the Lord of the Rings, you know, with everything in the books, but the thematic material is obviously critically important to translate that from book to film because the themes are ultimately at the heart of any book. And Tolkien's themes in particular were in his heart.
There's a tendency to expect too much of Tolkien and to expect answers that he never intended to provide. And there's a simultaneous oversimplification of what he wrote.
Tolkien himself was horrified at modern analogies being placed on his work. He always rejected the notion that the stories were based on World War II and the rise of Hitler and all that. I think to apply modern political thinking on a story that is essentially 50 years old is a little bit inappropriate.
Tolkien's famous for disliking allegory and maintaining with great force in his foreword to The Lord of the Rings that this is not an allegory.
As for any inner meanings or message, it has in the intention for the author none. It is neither allegorical nor topical. I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purposed domination of the author.
What he means by allegory, of course, is that you can have a one-to-one substitution. So the ring equals, nuclear energy. That kind of simple-minded interpretation is exactly what he was trying to avoid, and it's part of his genius that he didn't write an allegorical book. That's why new generations of readers can keep on finding meanings from their own lives because of what he called applicability, to enable you to fill in the precise meanings of the various things you're reading about from your own experience.
I think what Lord of the Rings is very good at portraying is that you can be courageous without having courage.
He was, I believe, writing the antithesis of commercial fiction. This notion of being able to go on and finding hope in hopelessness. The most poignant statements in The Lord of the Rings are the elves, for example, who have been fighting what Galadriel calls the long defeat. And they've been knowing that they will lose for the last few thousand years, but they will continue fighting until they're defeated.
Courage is also shown by plodding on even when you have no hope in the affair at all.
It is in the dark moment that the eye begins to see. You know, it's like when you've reached your lowest point, when things look bleakest, that's when you really get a wake-up call. Something is found within, to deal with the situation, to at least make the effort.
The emphasis on courage against overwhelming odds is essentially a pagan point of view. You fight on even though you know that in the end you will lose.
You can't have courage without fear. You can't be truly brave without knowing that there is something to fear and to overcome that fear in order to go out there and face it. You cannot weigh up the likelihood of your success as part of your venture. And that is why Frodo makes such a wonderful hero, because he is a halfling, he is a hobbit, he is small, and the forces he faces are huge.
Frodo's not the only hero. And of course, without the heroism of all the people who helped him, Frodo would have failed. Our fates are all interconnected, as opposed to depending on this heroic individualism. Tolkien was profoundly pluralist. The Lord of the Rings is a multicultural and multiracial book. Against that pluralism, you have Mordor, which is one ring to rule them all. I think Tolkien himself, personally, was quite pessimistic. But I think there's hope in the books. This is a phrase Tolkien used, by the way, hope without guarantees, a very good description of what his book offers. Despair is for people who know, beyond any doubt, what the future is going to be. Nobody's in that position. So despair is not only a kind of sin, theologically, it's also a simple mistake, because nobody actually knows. In that sense, there always is hope.
That's what's interesting about this story. There's no guarantee at any point of success. That's something no one can predict, what will happen. Even Galadriel, when it comes to it, in so many words says to Frodo, I can't tell you what's going to happen. I don't know.
More so than just being a straight struggle of good and evil, it is a struggle over loving the values of your world and being prepared to fight to the death to protect them.
It seems to me that the ring wraiths are Tolkien's most original and distinctive image of evil. And since he's a philologist, I think we should think about the word wraith. All right, what's a wraith? Well, it's actually related to words we know. For instance, it's related to wrath, which is anger. It's related to wreath, which is a twisted thing. It's related to the word writhe, which is to twist and turn. And all these suggest that actually a wraith is something which is defined by shape, not by substance.
There's this vacuity, this emptiness at the heart of the ring wraiths. They actually, in a sense, have no lives of their own. They're totally dependent on Sauron and on the One Ring. That's an interesting aspect of Tolkien's view of evil, kind of a moral vacuum, a lack of independent life.
This is something which is very distinctively modern. People of Tolkien's generation had a problem identifying evil. They had no difficulty recognizing it, they had to live through it. But the puzzling thing was that this seemed to be carried out by entirely normal people. And indeed, Tolkien, who was a combat veteran, knew that his own side did things like that too. The nature of evil in the 20th century has been curiously impersonal. It's as if sometimes nobody particularly wants to do it. In the end, you get the major atrocities of the 20th century being carried out by bureaucrats. Well, the people who do that kind of thing are wraiths. They've gone through the wraithing process. They don't know what's good and evil anymore. It's become a job or a routine. You start out with the good intentions, but somehow it all goes wrong. So it's a curiously distinctive image of evil, and I should also say it's a very unwelcome one, because what it says is it could be you. And in fact, under the right circumstances, or I should say the wrong circumstances, it will be you. When people say that this kind of fantasy fiction is escapist and evading the real world and so on, well, I think that's an evasion. It's actually trying to confront something that most people would rather not confront. We can never be quite sure about the ring, which I think is entirely appropriate to the story. Right at the start, Gandalf asks Frodo to hand him the ring, and when Frodo passes it over, it feels very heavy, as if either Frodo or the ring itself was reluctant to pass it over. Now, which was it? Was it Frodo or was it the ring? If it's Frodo, then we're in a kind of Freudian universe. Frodo does not want to hand the thing over, so subconsciously his own wishes make the ring feel heavy. In that case, the source of evil is internal. On the other hand, it could be the ring that's gone heavy. If that's the case, then the ring is actually an external power and can actually deceive you even when you don't mean it to. And if it's just from outside you and everybody can be trusted, good people can be trusted, then there's no real problem, is there? Anybody could take the ring. But that's not the case. We're told that again and again.
You must take it!
You cannot offer me this ring!
I'm giving it to you!
Don't tempt me, Frodo! I dare not take it. Not even to keep it safe.
Nobody can be trusted because there's something in everybody's heart which is the start of the wraithing process. So the ring works both ways. In some ways it's an external power which is frightening and aggressive and which you've got to resist. In some ways it's a sort of psychic amplifier which brings out what your own problems and weaknesses are. It's clear that the ring is, in its way, addictive. It's got all the complexities of that state. Nobody can trust themselves. As to what people are being addicted to, it seems to me that's really very clear. It is power. People start off with good intentions. They want the power in order to carry out the good intentions. But once they've got the power, they won't give it up, and the good intentions turn increasingly to bad intentions.
The Ring is also very contemporary because I think it has a profound affinity with technology.
He had a real problem with technology. He described once that the most evil creation ever visited on mankind was the internal combustion engine.
Technology is very powerful, very seductive, very addictive. The whole of society becomes incredibly dependent on technology so that when something does go wrong, it goes very wrong. Tolkien had a respect for the earth that was profound. The thing about Middle-earth in Lord of the Rings is it's like a character in itself with autonomy and subjectivity, and that's a profoundly ecological point of view. He did not agree at all with this view that nature is simply a passive set of resources for us to use as we will.
During his lifetime, you had continuing urban expansion. You had urban creep.
The city was going through enormous changes. It was gradually becoming the city of 1 million people. He could see the city creeping up the hill.
So that the area which he lived in, which he remembered as lush and pastoral and beautiful, really became absorbed into a major industrial city.
All those processes are still happening, and in some respects they've gathered steam. Things are going faster and faster in that direction. And in that sense, Tolkien's relevance is bound to increase.
For myself as a reader, what I find in there is a story that is timeless. And this is why it made it so accessible to so many people.
As filmmakers, as writers, we had no interest whatsoever in putting our junk, our baggage into these movies. We just thought we should take what Tolkien cared about clearly, we should take those and we should put them into the film. This should ultimately be Tolkien's film, it shouldn't be ours.